Imagine waking up on any given morning and discovering that your own children, the ones you raised with love, had become your executioners. On July 15, 2020, the Al-Harithi family appeared to live a seemingly normal life in Taif, Saudi Arabia. A prosperous father, a devoted mother, exemplary children in school. But behind closed doors, two teenagers were hiding a secret so dark they were willing to wipe out their entire family to protect it. What you are about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about the limits of human evil. Before continuing, write in the comments where you're watching from. This case deeply affected me because it shows how a family can hide the most disturbing secrets. If you have children, get ready. This story will make you rethink everything about parental supervision. Fahd Al-Harithi seemed to have achieved everything in life. At 50 years old, he was a respected businessman in Taif, known for his generosity and integrity. Married to Fatima, a devoted 40-year-old woman, he had built a family that many envied. 5 children, a comfortable home, financial stability, the Saudi dream fulfilled. Ahood, 19, was the model daughter, an art student at Taif University, intelligent and seemingly focused on her studies. Abdulaziz, 17, was his father's pride, an excellent high school student so dedicated that Fahd had bought him a 2020 car as a reward for his academic performance. Abdul Rahman, 26, was already working at a local company after graduating from university. And there was Abdullah, just 8 years old, a joyful child in elementary school. But here comes the first mystery that will leave you uneasy. Why would such a structured family hide such dark secrets? Neighbors often talked about how attentive Fahd was. Expensive smartphones for all the kids, imported perfumes, designer clothes. He never denied the family anything, especially Ahood, who was clearly the favorite daughter. She can ask her father for anything, acquaintances would say. And here arises the second disturbing question. When does excessive love become dangerous? Fatima was seen as a model mother, always concerned for her children's well-being. She woke up early to prepare breakfast, monitored their studies, participated in school activities, a traditional Saudi family functioning perfectly, at least on the surface. But prepare yourself for the third element that will turn everything upside down. Sometimes the most perfect families hide the most terrifying secrets, because in June 2020, Fatima would make a discovery that revealed all that family harmony was just a carefully crafted mask. A discovery so shocking that she herself would become the first victim in a chain of events that would completely destroy the Al-Harithi family. What she found on her children's phones didn't just break her heart, it sealed her fate and that of the entire family. Intimate conversations, compromising photos, messages filled with a love that crossed all moral and religious boundaries. Her 2 children, a brother and sister, had been in a secret sexual relationship for months. Here's the first question that will haunt you. How does a mother react upon discovering that her own children are committing incest? Fatima went into shock, not just because of the discovery itself, but because of the coldness with which her children carried on that forbidden relationship. There was planning, premeditation, even consumption of online content that fueled that behavior. They weren't victims of a moment of weakness. They were active participants in something that went against everything she believed in. And here comes the second devastating dilemma. When confronting your children means signing your own death sentence. Fatima's reaction was typical of a conservative Saudi mother. She confronted Ahood and Abdulaziz separately, then together. She cried, she screamed, she begged them to stop. But the ultimatum she gave was what sealed the fate of the entire family. You stop this abomination immediately, or I will tell your father everything when he returns from his trip. Yeah, but here's the third element that turns everything into a tragedy. She didn't know that her children had already completely lost the ability to feel remorse. For a conservative family in Saudi Arabia, the discovery of incest would be devastating. The scandal wouldn't just destroy the family's reputation, it could also bring severe legal consequences. Ahood and Abdulaziz knew this perfectly well. In the days following Fatima's ultimatum, something sinister began to form in the minds of the 2 siblings. They had 2 options: end the forbidden relationship and live with the shame, or eliminate the problem at its root. The choice they made revealed a psychological coldness that would turn a family discovery into one of the most shocking crimes in Saudi history. And the most terrifying part? They began planning it all with the same ease they used to plan romantic meetups. Between late June and early July 2020, Something diabolical was happening inside the Al-Harithi household. While Fatima thought she had resolved the issue with her threat, Ahoud and Abdulaziz had already made a decision that revealed just how deeply disturbed they were. They weren't going to end the incestuous relationship. Instead, they would eliminate the one who discovered the secret. Here comes the first terrifying revelation. They treated the planning of a murder like it was a school project. The conversations between the siblings, later recovered by police, show a chilling level of detachment. They discussed methods of killing, ideal times, how to dispose of the body, all via text messages, like typical teens chatting about a party. Ahoud took on the role of mastermind. She was the one researching sedatives online, how to stage accidents, and how to eliminate evidence. Abdulaziz would be the executioner, the one to hold the weapon and pull the trigger. And here comes the second disturbing element, how easily they managed to obtain the means to commit the crime. On July 8, 2020, Ahoud calmly walked into a pharmacy in Taif. She smiled at the pharmacist and said she needed a strong sedative for her mother, who suffered from severe insomnia. The man, suspecting nothing, sold the medication to a 19-year-old girl who appeared concerned about her mother's health. On July 9 and 10, they did something that reveals the depth of their psychopathy. They tested small doses of the sedative in Fatima's juice. They observed the effects, timed how long she slept, adjusted the quantities. But here's the third aspect that will leave you speechless. They documented everything, as if it were a scientific experiment. Fatima noticed she was feeling more drowsy than usual, but attributed it to the exhaustion of housework. She had no idea her own children were testing her like a lab subject. The plan was simple: sedate her completely, wait for everyone to be asleep, and then execute her with a shot to the head during the night. They would make it look like a botched robbery, or possibly an accidental shooting. They even managed to get a pistol, stolen from an illegal weapons depot in Taif. For two seemingly normal teenagers, they had surprisingly dangerous connections. On July 11, 2020, everything was ready. Ahoud had the sedative, Abdulaziz had the gun. The plan was in place. What they didn't know was that this night would change everything, turning a simple murder into the massacre of an entire family. 6. The night of the first massacre, July 11, 2020, 9 p.m. A night that began like any other family dinner would become the prelude to the greatest horror the Al-Harithi family could have ever imagined. Ahoud prepared dinner with special care that night. Basmati rice, seasoned chicken, a meal Fatima always praised. But this time there was a secret ingredient carefully mixed into 3 portions. A lethal dose of sedative for Fatima, Abdul Rahman, and Abdullah. Here is the first image that will haunt you. A sister serving death on a plate to her own family, smiling as she watches the meat. After the meal, around 9:30 p.m., the 3 began showing signs of intense drowsiness. Abdul Rahman commented that he felt unusually tired. 8-year-old Abdullah barely managed to finish dessert before stumbling off to bed. Fatima blamed the exhaustion on a long day of housework. By 10 p.m., they were all in a deep, heavy sleep. Ahoud and Abdulaziz waited patiently until 4:30 a.m. on July 12th, the time when they were certain the sedative would be at full effect. And here comes the second terrifying moment, the coldness with which they prepared to kill their own mother. Abdulaziz picked up the pistol. Ahoud stood by his side, not to stop him but to guide him. They walked silently to Fatima's bedroom. She was fast asleep, completely defenseless because of the sedative, but then something happened that neither of them had anticipated. Get ready for the third element that turned a planned murder into an uncontrolled massacre. 8-year-old Abdullah woke up. Perhaps it was the sound of footsteps in the hallway, perhaps a child's instinct for danger. He stumbled out of his room and saw his older siblings in the hallway, with Abdulaziz holding a gun pointed at their mother's bedroom. Abdullah's innocent eyes widened in terror. He tried to run, tried to scream for help, tried to reach Fatima to wake her up. Abdulaziz didn't hesitate for a second. He turned the gun toward his younger brother and fired a shot to the back of the child's neck. The dry crack of the gun echoed through the house. Abdullah collapsed in the living room, a pool of blood quickly forming beneath his head. His final moments were filled with confusion and pure terror. The gunshot woke Abdul Rahman, who ran from his room to investigate. What he found was pure horror. His little brother lying in a pool of blood, and Abdulaziz still holding the smoking gun. Before he could fully process what he was seeing, the second shot struck Abdul Rahman in the neck. He collapsed next to Abdullah, 2 brothers dead in under a minute. In just 60 seconds, the simple plan had turned into something far more sinister. 7. The execution of the mother. The sound of the 2 gunshots did what even the strongest sedative could not. It woke Fatima from her deep sleep. Even drugged, her maternal instinct pulled her back to consciousness. She stumbled out of her room, still dizzy, trying to understand where the strange noises had come from. What Fatima saw in the living room was a scene her mind initially refused to accept. Here is the most devastating image you can imagine: a mother seeing her 2 sons lying in pools of blood. Abdullah, her 8-year-old baby, was lying on the floor with his head shattered by a bullet to the back of the neck. Abdul Rahman, her 26-year-old eldest son, lay beside his younger brother, also coldly executed. The blood of the 2 children mingled on the cold floor of the living room. Fatima let out a scream that echoed through the empty house. It wasn't just pain. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. She collapsed to her knees, trying to reach her children, trying to wake them, denying the reality before her eyes. And here comes the second moment that reveals the killer's utter coldness. They watched her suffer before taking action. Ahud and Abdulaziz stood just a few meters away, observing Fatima's agony with a disturbing calm. There was no remorse in their eyes, no hesitation. It was as if they were watching a movie, not witnessing the destruction of their own family. Fatima looked up and saw her 2 living sons in front of her. For a moment, a flicker of hope. Maybe they could explain. Maybe they could help. Maybe there was some explanation for the nightmare. "My sons, what happened? Call the police. Call an ambulance," she begged through tears. But here comes the third element that turns everything into absolute horror. Ahud's cold reply. "We're not calling anyone, Mother," Ahud said in a mechanical voice devoid of any emotion. "You found out our secret. You threatened to expose us. That couldn't go on." Realization struck Fatima like lightning. Her own sons, the same ones she had carried in her womb, breastfed, raised with love, were responsible for this massacre. Before she could fully process the betrayal, Abdulaziz raised the gun again. Fatima didn't try to run. She didn't beg for her life. She simply closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. The third shot hit the back of Fatima's neck. She collapsed beside the children she tried to save, but who had already been dead for minutes. But for Ahud and Abdulaziz, that still wasn't enough. They needed absolute certainty. Abdulaziz went to the kitchen, grabbed the sharpest knife he could find, and returned to where Fatima lay dying. 5 stabs to the chest and abdomen, 5 precise blows to make sure there was no doubt. In less than 10 minutes, 3 members of the Al-Harithi family were dead, and the murderers, they remained there, observing the result of their work with the same coldness one might have while admiring a completed piece of art. What happened between July 12th and 14, 2020 in the Al-Harithi household defies any normal human understanding. Ahud and Abdulaziz didn't flee. They didn't panic. They didn't call the police pretending to have found the bodies. They simply continued living in the house with 3 corpses. Here's the first image that will make you nauseous. 2 teenagers having breakfast in the kitchen while their mother's body rotted just a few meters away. On the morning of July 12th, Ahud made breakfast as usual. Abdulaziz watched television in the living room beside the bodies of Fatima, Abdul Rahman, and Abdullah. They casually discussed what to do next, as if planning a weekend trip. The smell of decomposition quickly intensified due to the July heat in Saudi Arabia. But they adapted, opened windows, used perfume, covered their noses when necessary. And here emerges the second terrifying aspect, the psychotic normalcy with which they tried to deal with the problem of the bodies. On the afternoon of the 12th, they made their first attempt to dispose of evidence. They decided Abdullah, being the smallest, would be the easiest to eliminate first. They dragged the 8-year-old's body to an outdoor storage area of the house. They poured gasoline over the small body and set it on fire. But the body didn't burn as they expected. The fire wasn't strong enough to fully consume the remains. Worried someone might notice the smoke, they extinguished the flames and brought the partially burned body back inside. But here's the third element that reveals the level of their insanity. They slept peacefully that night, with 3 decomposing bodies in the living room. On July 13th, they tried a different approach. They went to a hardware store in Taif and bought a pickaxe and a shovel. The new plan was to bury Abdullah in a remote mountainous area, about 20 kilometers from Jia. They placed the child's body in the car, the same 2020 model Fard had lovingly bought for Abdulaziz, and drove to a deserted area. but the rocky soil made it impossible to dig a hole deep enough. They tried burning the body again on sight, but panicked when they saw headlights from passing cars nearby. They extinguished the fire, placed the body back in the car, and returned home. Again. During those 3 days, they cleaned and re-cleaned the blood from the floor and walls, but the blood had dried and clung to the surfaces, leaving dark stains that refused to come off completely. It was as if the house itself was testifying against them, and throughout those moments, one terrifying question lingered in the air. Where was Fahd? The father was on a business trip in Jeddah, unaware that 3 of his 5 children were already dead, but that macabre calm was about to end. Because on July 14th, Fahd called asking why Fatima hadn't answered the phone in 2 days, and that was the moment Ahoud and Abdulaziz realized they would have to kill again. 9. The father's return, July 14th, 2020, 4:02 p.m. The phone rang at the Al-Harithi house, breaking the morbid silence that had settled between Ahoud, Abdulaziz, and the 3 decomposing corpses. It was Fahd, calling from Jeddah, where he had been on an extended business trip for a week. "Why hasn't your mother answered the phone in 2 days? I've tried calling several times," Fahd said, the worried voice of a husband who knew his wife's habits well. Here comes the first lie that would seal the father's fate. Abdulaziz's cold and calculated response. "Oh, Dad, Mum's just been really busy deep cleaning the house. You know how she gets when she decides to do a full cleaning," Abdulaziz replied with chilling casualness as he looked directly at Fatima's decomposing body in the living room. Fahd laughed on the other end. "Typical of your mother. Tell her I'll be home tomorrow afternoon, around 2 p.m. Ask her to make that lunch I love. She knows which one." "Of course, Dad. She'll be very happy you're coming back," Abdulaziz lied, hanging up the phone with the same ease as if saying goodbye to a friend. And here comes the second moment that reveals the brothers' absolute coldness. The decision to kill their father was made without hesitation. Ahoud, who had overheard the entire conversation, looked at Abdulaziz. There was no debate, no tears, no moral hesitation. The conclusion was purely logical. If Fahd came home, he'd discover the bodies, call the police, and they'd be arrested. The solution? Eliminate the father as well. "He can't come inside the house," Ahoud simply said. "We'll have to do it at the gate before he sees anything." Now comes the third terrifying aspect. They planned their father's murder with the same casualness one uses when preparing to receive a guest. During the night of July 14th to 15th, they organized everything. Abdulaziz cleaned the pistol, the same one he had used to execute their mother and siblings. Ahoud planned the reception. She would go out to greet their father as usual, distracting him with hugs and conversation, while Abdulaziz positioned himself behind the front gate. July 15th, 2020, 2:10 p.m. Fahd's car stopped in front of the gate. He was happy, eager to see his family after a week of hard work. He brought gifts for everyone, perfumes for Fatima and Ahoud, an expensive shirt for Abdulaziz. Ahoud ran out to greet him, just as she had since childhood. "Dad, I missed you so much," she shouted, throwing herself into his arms with a radiant smile that betrayed none of the horror that had taken place in the house. Fahd hugged her tightly, feeling the genuine love he had always had for his favorite daughter. "Where's your mother and the boys?" "They're all inside, excited to see you. Abdul Rahman is helping Mum in the kitchen. Abdullah's watching cartoons," Ahoud lied, keeping her smile as she led her father toward the gate. Fahd didn't see Abdulaziz hidden behind the entrance. He didn't notice the barrel of the pistol aimed at his head. He had no inkling of what was about to happen. Fahd's final thought was one of joy for being home. The gunshot echoed through the empty yard. Fahd collapsed to the ground, a pool of blood quickly forming beneath his head. Ahoud wasn't startled by the sound. She didn't scream. She simply helped Abdulaziz drag their father's body inside. Now there were 4 corpses, and the Al-Harithi home had become a true cemetery. 10. The planned fire. July 15th, 2020, 2:30 p.m. Fahd Al-Harithi lay dead in the yard of his own home, executed by the sons he had loved unconditionally. Ahoud and Abdulaziz dragged their father's body to the living room, placing it next to the other 3 corpses, Fatima, Abdul Rahman, and Abdullah. 4 members of the family were dead, a house covered in dried blood, the smell of decomposition filling every room. Here is the first decision that reveals how they had completely lost control of the situation. Burn everything. "We can't keep trying to get rid of the bodies one by one," said Ahoud, observing the macabre scene in the living room. "We have to make everything disappear at once." The solution they came up with was as drastic as it was simple. Turn the entire house into a bonfire. Eliminate all evidence in one go and pretend it had all been a tragic accident, a fire that killed the entire family while they were, fortunately, away from home. And here comes the second element that shows the level of premeditation. They knew exactly how to make it look accidental. They left the house at 3 p.m. and went to the nearest gas station in Gia. They bought 5 gallons of fuel, telling the attendant it was for their home generator. No one suspected anything. They were 2 well-known young men in the area, sons of a respected family. Back at the house, they methodically poured gasoline throughout every room, on the furniture, curtains, rugs, and especially over the 4 bodies in the living room. They wanted to ensure nothing would be left for further analysis. But here is the third aspect that shows how they tried to be smart. They created multiple possible causes for the fire. Abdulaziz took a screwdriver and deliberately punctured the kitchen's gas cylinder, creating a leak. The idea was for investigators to conclude that gas had built up and exploded, or that some short circuit had caused the fire. They scattered extinguished cigarette butts around the house to make it seem like someone had smoked and left a lit one behind. They also disconnected a few electrical wires to simulate faulty wiring. At 7:30 p.m., everything was set. The 2 brothers stood outside the house, made sure no neighbors were watching, and then Ahoud lit a match. The gasoline ignited instantly. Flames spread with terrifying speed, consuming furniture, walls, and most importantly, the 4 bodies in the central room. Within minutes, the entire house was engulfed in a raging fire. Ahoud and Abdulaziz calmly walked out to the street, and then, like actors stepping into a scene, began their final performance. "Help, fire, my family is inside," screamed Ahoud, running frantically toward the nearest neighbors. Abdulaziz stood in front of the house with his hands on his head, pretending to be in shock. "I can't believe it. My whole family," he murmured to those approaching to comfort him. The neighbors, moved by compassion, immediately called the fire department and the police. Some tried to approach the house to help, but the intense heat and toxic smoke made any rescue attempt impossible. By 8 p.m., sirens began echoing through the neighborhood. The 2 survivors continued their flawless act, crying and mourning in front of everyone who offered support. But what Ahoud and Abdulaziz didn't know was that the Saudi police had far more experience with staged crimes than they imagined. 11. The investigation and confession. July 16, 2020, 6 a.m. While Ahoud and Abdulaziz slept in the home of neighbors who had compassionately taken them in after the tragedy, a team of forensic investigators from the Taif police was discovering that the fire hid much more than it appeared. The smell coming from the burned house wasn't just charred wood and fabric, it was the unmistakable odor of advanced decomposition, bodies that had been dead for days, not hours. Here is the first piece of evidence that completely dismantled the brothers' act. Forensic analysis revealed that 3 of the 4 victims had been dead for 3 to 4 days. Dr. Ahmad Al-Zahrani, a criminal expert with 15 years of experience, examined the charred bodies and made a shocking discovery. Fatima, Abdul Rahman, and Abdullah showed clear signs of death before the fire. The state of decomposition in Fatima's abdomen, in particular, indicated that she had died around July 12 or 13. "This wasn't an accident," Al-Zahrani told the lead investigator. "We're dealing with premeditated executions." And here comes the second devastating piece of evidence. All 4 victims had been shot in the back of the head, the classic method of execution. Even with the bodies partially burned, the forensic team was able to identify bullet holes. Fatima also had 5 stab wounds in her chest and abdomen. There were no traces of smoke in the lungs of 3 of the victims, confirming that they had died before the fire. Analysis of the scene revealed traces of gasoline in quantities far higher than would be found in an accidental fire. The gas cylinder had been intentionally punctured, and there were no electrical faults to explain the blaze. But here is the third element that sealed the murderer's fate: neighborhood security cameras. The footage clearly showed that no strangers had entered the property in the past 4 days. The only people who had come and gone were Ahoud and Abdulaziz. Even more damning, the cameras captured the 2 leaving the house at 3 p.m. on July 15th and returning with gasoline cans. July 16th, 2 p.m. Chief Investigator Khalid Al-Ghamdi summoned the 2 survivors to give statements at the Taif police station. He started with Abdulaziz, the younger and potentially more psychologically vulnerable one. "Tell me exactly where you were when the fire started," Al-Ghamdi said, watching every expression on the 17-year-old's face. I had gone out to buy some things at the market. When I came back, the house was on fire. I ran to try to help, but it was too late, Abdulaziz replied, sticking to the rehearsed version. How interesting, said the investigator, placing security camera photos on the table. Because here you are leaving the house at 3 p.m. with your sister, carrying gasoline cans. And here you are returning at 7:30 p.m., just minutes before the fire started. At that moment, something cracked in Abdulaziz's expression. The mask of a victim began to fall apart. These images might be wrong, he stammered, his hands beginning to tremble. Al-Ghamdi continued, we also have the forensic report. Your mother had been dead for 4 days. Your siblings too, all executed with gunshots to the back of the head. How do you explain that? Abdulaziz began to sweat. His answers became confused, contradictory. With each question he got more tangled, changing details of the story, inventing new versions. After 6 hours of intense interrogation, in the early hours of July 17th, Abdulaziz completely broke down. It was all Ahud's fault, he shouted, covering his face with his hands. She planned everything. I just did what she told me to. And then, between sobs and tremors, Abdulaziz confessed every macabre detail of the murders, the discovery of the incest, the mother's ultimatum, the planning, the sedatives, the executions, the 3 days living with the corpses, the father's return, and finally, the fire. When confronted with Abdulaziz's full confession, Ahud also collapsed. But her confession revealed something even more disturbing. She showed no remorse, only anger at being caught. The case was closed, but the details that emerged shocked even the most seasoned investigators. July 18, 2020. In the cells of Taif prison, Ahud and Abdulaziz Al-Harithi awaited the trial that would determine their fates. The full investigation had uncovered an even more disturbing truth. The siblings' phones contained evidence that they had consumed extremely disturbing online content, including material that normalized incestuous relationships and violent behavior. The forensic analysis of the devices, despite 90% of the data being deleted by the siblings themselves, recovered conversations that showed how the forbidden relationship had evolved over months, fueled by toxic digital content they had accessed online without supervision. This is the first devastating lesson of this case. Digital neglect can be just as dangerous as physical neglect. The trial lasted 3 long years, from August 2020 to October 2023. Judges from Mecca, Riyadh, and Jeddah participated in the process. Such was the impact of the crime on Saudi society. Every detail was meticulously analyzed, every piece of evidence reviewed multiple times. Psychiatric evaluations confirmed that both were mentally sound at the time of the crimes. There were no mental illnesses, no drug use, no history of abuse. They were simply 2 teenagers who chose the path of absolute evil to protect a shameful secret. And here is the second terrifying truth. Sometimes evil has no explanation. Sometimes seemingly normal people are capable of the worst horrors. October 24, 2023. The judge's gavel sealed the final fate of Ahud and Abdulaziz Al-Harithi, execution by beheading in accordance with Saudi Arabia's law of retribution, Qisas. The sentence was carried out the same day, in a public square in the Mecca region, in front of judicial and police authorities. 2 lives ended. But 4 innocent people had already been brutally murdered by those who were supposed to protect them. But the third and most important lesson is for all of us who are parents, guardians of children and teenagers. This case is not just about 2 criminals. It's about how parental neglect, unrestricted internet access, and the lack of open dialogue at home can create monsters within our own families. Fahd Al-Harithi was a generous father who gave his children everything materially. But did he know what they were doing online? Did he know what kind of content they were consuming? Did he talk openly about sexuality, healthy relationships, moral boundaries? The answer is no, and that cost the lives of an entire family. If you are a parent, don't just be a provider. Be a digital protector. Monitor your children's devices. Talk about the dangers of the internet. Create an environment where they can talk about anything without fear of judgment. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next cases that could protect you. I'll see you in the next case. And remember, protect your children, both in the real world and in the digital world.